Russian forces continue their offensive operations along the Pokrovsk-Mynarad pocket, now directly connecting the city of Pokrovsk with Rodinsk along the main highway by gaining physical control over it and pushing westwards along the pig farms towards the fortifications along the northern flank of Pokrovsk and Hryshine. At the same time, the Russians continue the pressure on the entryway, pushing onwards towards Mynarad, further closing the pocket and whatever remains of Ukrainian forces within it. The Russians also continue offensive operations on the eastern parts of Mynarad, gaining control over additional streets in the eastern residential area, where they're pushing along the northern flank of the apartment complex area and towards the school number 4 in the eastern parts of the city. With this, the Russians continue offensive operations alongside the apartment complex area, taking full control of it, push down along the southern bank of the river line, moving through the central parts of Mynarad, and to connect with the forces with the southern part of Mynarad, and then onwards towards the northern section, where fighting also takes place along the northern apartment complex buildings and the western flank near Svitle and Rivne. Many people asked me in my previous update how many Ukrainian soldiers are encircled within Mynarad, and the only answer that is reliable at this point is it's completely unclear. According to Syriac maps, approximately less than 1,000 soldiers remain within the pocket, while some still attempt to withdraw with the physical enclosure of the pocket. It is unlikely anyone else will make it out. While it is realistic that less than 1,000 soldiers remains within Mynarad, considering the slow advance by the Russians, it is also possible that there are more. It is not easy to get a full picture of how many soldiers there are within Mynarad, but considering the manpower shortage, having more than 1,000 soldiers within Mynarad at this point would have been difficult for the Ukrainians. What remains within Mynarad is resupplied with the use of drones. That means it is limited how many supplies can come to the pocket and the soldiers acting within it. However, it is still possible for them not to starve at the very least. So that means they can hold out for a long time as long as they have somewhere to be within. According to Syriac maps, they are also advancing at a slow pace on purpose, with the purpose being to put psychological pressure on the Ukrainians, the fact that they are encircled, and with the slow advance, they are forcing the Ukrainians to give up and surrender to the Russian forces, because the Russians simply are taking their time, they're not taking any risks, which decreases the efficiency of any defensive maneuvers the Ukrainians are performing, because the Russians are taking a very safe approach. To the north of Pokrovsk, the Russians made a small advance to the east of Stepanivka, as they are putting pressure on the next settlement following the capture of Shahove and Volodymyrivka, securing the northern flank and advancing along the fortifications along the river line. As for the southwest of Pokrovsk, the Russians continue offensive operations west of Udashne and the coal mine along the fortifications, gaining control over additional forest lines in the area as they develop offensive operations along the border between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions. The offensive operations here are targeting the direction of Stepanivka, where the capture of the coal mine opens up the road for offensive operations by the Russians along the western highway, the E50 highway, as well as the railway moving towards the Dnipropetrovsk region and the Dnipro city. With this, the Russians are developing offensive operations alongside the highway, the forest lines within the area between the railways, and now pressure on Stepanivka as well. The southwest of this Russian offensive operations continue along the first and second lines of defense, gaining control over new forest lines to the northwest of Solotke and entering into Dobropilya from the north. The advance by the Russians captures the fortified positions in the area, gains a foothold within the residential buildings, and gains control of an additional forest line connecting from the Yancho River to the Aicho River on the western flank. The Russians also continued offensive operations in the direction of Huliaipole, gaining control over the fortifications northwest of Satisha and putting continuous pressure on the northern bank of the river line to secure the northern flank for offensive operations towards Huliaipole itself, where the Russians continued the pressure on the eastern and northern flanks of the city. Offensive operations continues both in the direction of Huliaipole and Dobropilya along the first and second lines of defense. In the southwestern parts of the Zaporizhzhia region, the Russians continued offensive operations on the western flank of Stepanivka, gaining control over additional fortifications along the Dacha area, securing the foothold and bridgehead across the river line here along the western flank of Stepanivka with the capture of the fortifications. At the same time, the remaining fortifications have entered into the gray zone, with a Russian push to the north of Stepanivka, aiming at encircling the town. At the same time, a combined push also comes from the eastern flank, where the Russians are storming the eastern flank of Stepanivka. So a pincer maneuver from both flanks, looking at cutting off the supplies to Stepanivka and encircle the town before storming it directly from the western and southern directions. This comes after weeks of fighting over the town and the surrounding dacha areas. As for the northwest of Stepanivka, Ukrainian forces launched a counterattack, regaining control of some positions, and most of it remains contested as the Russian forces are mainly infiltrating this area, and they aren't very concentrated, they're very dispersed, which limits the Ukrainian capture and holding of these areas as constant drones flies between the two sides as well as artillery strikes. According to Deep State Map, the Russians are mainly moving through the river line itself, the Dnipro River, where due to the Novakhovka Dam being broken years ago, at this point, the Russians are able to move through the Dnipro River because the reservoir itself has been emptied out, and due to the long time since it has been emptied out, it is walkable by infantry if they take enough precautions. The Russian forces have been able to completely avoid the choke point, which is the river line, by bypassing through the normal area. We cannot see, unfortunately, due to the satellite imagery not being updated, but according to Deep State Map, they've been moving with infantry across the Dnipro River itself and then into the northern parts, where they've been fighting along the dacha area and infiltrating behind Ukrainian lines. So with this, the Russians are doing a combined push along the dacha area, where the Ukrainians are also counterattacking, and then now a pincer maneuver to encircle Stepanivka and put pressure on it directly. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russian offensive continues within Siversk, gaining control over much of the eastern portion of the town. The Russians now have full control over the fortifications on the eastern flank. With this, there is no defensive fortification under Ukrainian control defending the town itself from the eastern, northern or southern directions. Instead, what remains is entirely in the western flank, overlooking the town itself. With this, Russians now have several roads leading into Siversk, the main road going through Kupyansk, and the Russians are putting pressure on the eastern parts. Deep State Map even puts the eastern part of Siversk in the gray zone, which means the Russians likely have full control over the eastern portion in its entirety. And for the western portion, the Russians would have to fight over the fortifications before they're able to securely gain control of it, especially with the Bakhmutovka River separating the western parts into two portions, but also mainly due to the fact that the fortifications are located on the high ground overlooking the town itself, which means Russian troop movement within Siversk will be detected by the forces within the trenches, and they have their fortifications to cover in while their drone operators and artillery launches strikes on the Russian forces operating within Siversk. Therefore, the Ukrainians have a great advantage as long as they hold control over the fortifications, but a Russian push from the rear from Platonivka and Dnipro will allow the Russian forces to flank these fortifications from their weak spot, which is from the rear, facing away from the direction the fortifications are facing, and striking them from the weak spot will allow them to gain control over the fortifications overlooking Siversk itself, and thereby gain control over the town itself to continue offensive operations towards the southern defensive line located here west of Siversk, which will again be exposed due to the Russians being in control over the high ground and being able to attack them from the rear and their weak point, allowing them to gain an advantage when fighting beyond that of Siversk. In the Kupyansk section of the front line, fighting continues both within the city and on the eastern flank. The Ukrainians continue counterattacks east of Pishane, regaining control over some of the forest lines along the railway and all the way to the fortifications just outside Stepov and Novoselivka. Again, I cannot find the logic in the Ukrainians continuing their counterattacks here east of Kupyansk within the pocket, as the Ukrainians have limited supply going to their forces operating east of the Usk River line, and the Russians continue offensive operations within Kupyansk itself to gain full control over the city and push down south towards Kupyansk-Veslovy, where the Russians will look to gain full control and physical control over any exit out of the pocket. As for the supplies being directed to the eastern bank of the Usk River line to resupply the Ukrainian forces, they are constantly being struck by Russian long-range strikes whenever they cross over the river, and the Russians are also striking any reinforcements coming to the area, which limits the Ukrainian defensive and offensive capabilities, despite the fact that they are under pressure and their supply lines are being struck, the Ukrainians continue their offensive operations to regain control over portions far from the danger point, which is the Kupyansk and Stepanivka directions. Now back to the Pokrovsk section of the front line, we have to discuss an interesting topic, and that is, while it is not clear how many Ukrainian soldiers is within the Minerat pocket, according to Deep State map, the concentration of Russian forces within Pokrovsk has significantly increased. Ignoring the gray zones in the area, we can take a look at what the Ukrainians and Deep State map claims is within Pokrovsk of Russian forces. If we take a look at the different brigades, we can see a Guards Motor Rifle Brigade, a battalion of special forces, another motorized rifle brigade, and motorized rifle regiment, separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade, special purpose brigade, which is another special forces unit, separate special purpose battalion, and then a motorized rifle regiment. This means 2 motorized rifle regiments, 3 motorized rifle brigades, 1 special forces brigade, and 2 special forces battalions. Based on these different units, according to pre-war numbers on the sizes of different brigades, regiments, and so on, the Russians have a concentration of approximately 15,000 soldiers and 2,500 special forces, of which half of the soldiers are supportive roles, logistics, artillery, so on, and 500 of the special forces are supportive roles, which means approximately 9,000 to 10,000 Russian soldiers operating with and around the city, with their forces being spread from the western flank towards Reshene, the northern flank within the city itself, where they're building up the logistics and concentrating their forces, towards Menerat, the northeast towards Rudenske, and all around. All of these forces, as we can see, are operating from the western flank of Pokrovsk and onto the Minerat direction itself. That is, of course, if the Russians are in full force and haven't taken any casualties, which of course they have. Reinforcements would have arrived, and there are other units as well in the near vicinity, additional motorized rifle regiments, brigades, and so on. But all in all, the number of Russian forces within Pokrovsk itself is likely around there at the 10,000 mark, where they can launch offensive operations beyond Pokrovsk in the direction of Reshene, Minerat, Rudenske, and onwards towards Dobropilya. This is the main center of logistics for the Russian forces moving forward for offensive operations going in any direction to the north and west from here onwards. And that is why the Russians are simply taking their time with the capture of Minerat, because they are able to slowly build up the concentration of forces within Pokrovsk, and once they are ready to move beyond Minerat, they will be able to quickly close the pocket and move onwards for their next offensive operations, so that they keep up their momentum, draw in Ukrainian forces, supplies, and then move onwards towards the defensive lines of the Ukrainians beyond that of Pokrovsk. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.